Today I'm taking this rusty old leaf spring and I'm going to turn it into a knife. Don't know if I'd call this a survival knife or a bushcraft knife. It's definitely something I would use outdoors, maybe camping or hiking. So I started out just doing a rough sketch of kind of the idea for the knife. Then measured out the leaf spring, cut off the excess. And this leaf spring it's car leaf spring. It's tapered along the edges, and it's also hardened steel. So a couple things I had to deal with before I could really do any cutting. I needed to soften it up. So I heated it up in the forge and let it cool down slowly in some vermiculite for several hours, and then I was able to mark it out and cut off that tapered edge there on my little portable bandsaw. I tried cutting that steel without annealing it or normalizing it first, and it doesn't cut very well. It just tears up the bandsaw blade. So after I had that done, there still had a little bit of that taper left on the edge, and that's what I'm forging there, just trying to square up those edges. Once I was done with the forging, it was time to remove the scale. I did that with the grinder, angle grinder. Then I marked my pattern out and went ahead and just cut that piece out on the little bandsaw. So I did all the profiling with an angle grinder and a little 1x48 belt sander. And for the choil there, I used a 3/16 chainsaw file to file that groove there. And I marked out the center line, and then it was back to the belt sander to put in the initial rough grind on the blade. And I used the little plunge line jig that I made in a previous video to help me get that plunge line straight on both sides. So at this point, the knife was still a little heavy in the handle, and I still had more hand sanding to do on the blade portion. So I went ahead and drilled some holes in the handle just to lighten it up and try and even out the balance. After I had those holes drilled, I normalized it twice and then quenched in Parks 50. After quenching, and it's got a hell of a warp to it. So yeah, it's warped pretty bad, and I tried clamping it to a plate, heating it up to about 400 and cooling it off with cold water. I did that twice. That really didn't get all of the warp out, and so I ended up putting it in my vise and heating it up with a torch and then cooling one side of it with water, and I was finally able to get the warp out and get it straightened out. So after I was done with the heat treating and the tempering, I hand sanded it up to 320 grit and then moved on to start working on the handle. Had a couple of bloodwood scales that I used for the handle. Mark that out and fit it out on the bandsaw. I got my holes marked out and got the holes all drilled in it. Once I had the scales all sanded and got that profile done on those, it was time to put the secondary bevel on the blade, and that's just a little wooden jig at about a 27-degree or so angle that I'm using with the belt sander so I can grind in that secondary bevel. And once I had that done, finished up the hand sanding on the blade. I've sanded it up to 800 grit. Then I went ahead and sharpened it on my Arkansas stone. I was able to get it pretty sharp. So here I'm cleaning all the grease and oil off before bluing it. And for the bluing, I used Brownell's Oxfo Blue. It's the first time I'd ever used that product. I'd used Birchwood Casey's Permablue in the past. I'd say they probably perform about the same. If I would probably prefer the Brownells. I think it might have performed a little bit better. And I put a couple of coats on that and blued the whole knife. So for the scales, I used boiled linseed oil. Wipe that on, let it soak in for several hours, clean that off. Then some paste wax, basically furniture paste wax. Let that dry, and then buff that off. Try and get a good polished surface on the scales. So once I had all that done, it was time to glue up the handle. Use some 30-minute epoxy, clamped it up, let it sit under the heat lamp for several hours. And so putting it under the heat lamp for a few hours really speeds up the curing of the epoxy. Let that sit and cure, unclamp it, and that a finished knife made from leaf spring. So we'll see you next time, and adios, amigos.